I'm absolutely fascinated by ancient letters. They offer us a window into the everyday lives of humans just like us who lived thousands of years ago. They're also highly relevant for the study of the New Testament and especially the Apostle Paul. In this video, I offer what I think are the 5 most important things for you to know about ancient letters and letter writings. We're going to take a look at a number of real ancient letters, both in their physical forms and also in English translations. We'll also sprinkle in some aspects of New Testament letters as well. We'll begin with number 5 and work our way down to number 1. Number 5. Letters were a common form of communication, and we possess thousands of them from the ancient world that address a variety of topics. We've talked previously and briefly about how letters were a very common literary genre. They're one of the most common documents that we have from the ancient world. This is in large part due to the work of these 2 suave-looking gentlemen, Bernard Grenfell on the left and Arthur Hunt on the right. They were papyrologists, those who study ancient papyri, who excavated the ancient Egyptian city of Oxyrhynchus in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Because of Egypt's arid climate, thousands of ancient documents have been preserved in its sands over the years, and especially in rubbish heaps. Grenfell and Hunt led large teams of mostly local laborers to dig massive trenches into the sands and recover the documentary trash that had been preserved for thousands of years. What's remarkable about Grenfell and Hunt's finds, and the finds of many papyrologists that would follow in their footsteps, is that the documents they found were largely non-literary in nature. That is, these were texts that did not mainly consist of Homer or scriptures, but the kinds of things you might expect to find in a dump. Petitions, receipts, invitations, and most importantly for our purposes, letters. These letters are of varying types, but many of them are the kinds of letters that everyday people wrote. They're not the letters of the elites, emperors, and the like. In this way, their authors are probably more similar to the authors of the New Testament letters. While most writers of the New Testament were probably fairly well educated, they had to be able to write in the first place, they didn't sit at the very top of the social ladder. Just as today, ancient letters came in a whole bunch of different types. We have examples of official letters, philosophical and theological letters, circular letters, that is, letters that were sent to multiple different people or communities, business letters, and everyday letters. Let's look at examples of just a few. This is an excerpt of a circular letter from the Roman Emperor Tiberius sent to the city of Alexandria. It's a circular letter insofar as it addressed to all of the citizens of Alexandria. It would have been copied several times and read by a whole bunch of different people. This is not the kind of letter we would expect to find in the sands of Egypt. Rather, we might expect to have a copy of it because it was recopied several times in the ancient world. As a document written by the highest authority in the land, it is more likely to be passed down historically, just as we might expect that a letter from Abraham Lincoln to the residents of New York City would be passed down, even if we don't have the original version that came directly from the president. This here is an excerpt from the philosopher Seneca to his friend Lucilius. He gives some philosophical advice on how to live life. Like the letter from the Emperor Tiberius, we can expect that this letter would stand the test of time because of Seneca's fame and stature. This letter, however, we have no business possessing. There's absolutely no reason that we should be reading this short correspondence 2,000 years after it was written, except for the fact that it was randomly preserved in the sands of Egypt and then randomly found. It's part of what is called the Zenon Archive, a group of documents collected by a guy named Zenon. They are business affairs, and many of them are written by Zenon himself. This is the entirety of this letter. Zenon to Caius greeting. Deliver the 20 artabai of wheat to the bearer of this letter, as I have need of them in Alexandria. Ensure that they are of good quality and properly measured. Farewell. The brevity of this letter leads us to number 4. Number 4. Most everyday letters were surprisingly short. Here's another letter. This one is written just after the New Testament period, that is, a touch longer than Zenon's. Damus, assistant to Artemidora, my sister, greeting. Before else I make supplication for you every day. Please come up to the metropolis the new year, since I am also coming up to the city. Salute your mother and your father. I pray for your health. That's it. That's the entire letter, almost like a text message with a bit of epistolary fluff added on. While these two letters are in fact shorter than most everyday letters that have been recovered, they are not all that much shorter. It's hard to quantify the average length of letters because there are so many of them, and the length of a given letter varies depending on a whole host of factors, including who wrote it, to whom they are writing, what they're writing about, and so on and so forth. Nonetheless, I would estimate that most everyday papyri letters are about 200 words. Philosophers' letters tend to be a bit longer, at maybe 500 words or so. When it comes to the New Testament letters, we can be a bit more precise because we have a limited corpus. Pauline letters, the 13 letters that are attributed to Paul in the New Testament, clock in at about 2,500 words per letter. And the other non-Pauline letters come in at about 1,600 words per letter. In this way, most New Testament letters are a bit different, or at least a bit longer, than the average everyday letter in the ancient world. Number 3. Letters were typically written on papyrus and were either handwritten or dictated to a scribe. I haven't yet said anything about the pen on the right side of the screen. This is a real Roman reed pen from the New Testament. It was one of the standard writing implements from the Greco-Roman world. It would be dipped into ink and the point would be put to papyrus in order to write. Papyrus was the typical material for writing letters in the ancient world. It takes its name from the papyrus plant that grows in abundance on the shores of the river. To make the writing surface, stalks of the plant are cut, laid across one another, dried, and then pressed together. The final result is a surface that can be written on, as in this letter from a son to his father. What makes this letter so particularly interesting is it's clear that the young boy wrote it himself. The handwriting is not all that great. And neither is the boy's attitude. He begins the letter sarcastically. It was a fine thing of you not to take me with you to the city. Theon, the boy, is not happy about this. He threatens his father, also named Theon, that if he doesn't take him to the grand urban center that is Alexandria, he won't write him any more letters, he won't wish him well, and he won't hold his hand. He won't ever greet his father, and he'll starve and desiccate himself. Between the boy's endearingly impetuous tone and the handwriting of the letter, it's clear that Theon handwrote it himself. And this is one common way to write, despite the persistent myth that writing in the ancient world was normally done via dictation. There are many cases where we can be sure that a person handwrote a letter himself. There are also occasions when we know that all or most of a document was dictated to a scribe, sometimes also called an amanuensis. And as we shall see, this happened for a variety of different reasons. One reason was because a person could not write at all or very well. This is the case with this document, which, full disclosure, is not a letter, but there are many letters that are like it. Here we have an example of a scribe writing most of the document and someone who is a slow writer adding a few words, kind of like a signature. If you look closely, you might be able to identify where the slow writer writes, even if you don't know a lick of Greek. It's right here. A man named Kephilos signs the document, but he did not write it. In other cases, the entire document could be written by the scribe or amanuensis. Here we have evidence of that at the end of a letter. The scribe, whose name is Papyrus, sends greetings to the recipients, his wife, daughter, and horse. The ancients, just like us, loved animals. Papyrus is quite literally inscribing the document. He is penning the letters in it, but he is talked about in the third person. Papyrus greets you. This is what the dictator said to the scribe, who was Papyrus. A similar phenomenon occurs in this letter. But the letter writer switches into the first person. He says, I, Alexandros, wore myself out writing this letter. And it's actually pretty clear why Alexandros wore himself writing this letter. He's not a very elegant or good writer. He probably wasn't a professional scribe, but he knew how to write, so he agreed to take dictation for the author, who has a different name than Alexandros at the beginning of the document. But it took Alexandros some effort to do this, and he filled up the whole page, even using the side of the papyrus, which you can see if you look over to the left. What all this indicates is that letters were both handwritten and dictated. Both were options for how you wrote a text. This is true of everyday letters, but also letters that were written by Roman elites. Cicero dictates a letter to his friend Atticus rather than following their normal custom of writing in his own hand for a very good and honest reason. Lazy. In another instance, Cicero jokes about several different letters that were sent to him by the same person. He says that they're all nice, but it's odd that they're all in the sender's handwriting since the content of them are all so similar to one another. A joke's usually no good if you have to explain it, but here's the explanation. If someone in the ancient world was going to send multiple letters that were identical copies of one another, they wouldn't write them out themselves. They wouldn't handwrite them. They would hire that task of copying out. These letters, all sent to Cicero, were so similar in content that they might as well have been copies that one would have hired out rather than handwritten themselves. In short, for both the literary elites like Cicero and for normal everyday people, both handwriting and dictation were used to compose and copy letters. Number 2, authorship of letters is not a straightforward affair. If a text is dictated, it in a way has multiple authors, the person who is doing the dictation and the person who is taking the dictation. We tend to think of the named author as the sole individual, the literary genius behind the creation of the text. But this wasn't the case in the ancient world. It also isn't necessarily the case with respect to modern texts. Usually these are communal products with multiple people being involved in their creation, even if only one person is considered the author or is named as the author. It's helpful to think about authorship as a diverse and complicated phenomena that comes in various forms. The author of a text has varying levels of control over the document in these different kinds of authorship. When an author writes a letter or text in their own hand and no one else is involved, they have a very high level of control. But as more people get involved in the creation of the text, the more complicated things get and the more control an author cedes. If a text is dictated, two minds are involved in its creation, and the scribe may or may not write down exactly what the speaker says, even if they are instructed to. In some case, an author instructs a scribe the kind of letter they want written, but do not directly dictate its content. Usually the author will look over this kind of letter and maybe even edit it before sending it off. If an author is unavailable to finish a text or write one at all, students or admirers of that author might finish the document for them or write up what the author might say on certain topics. Similarly, after an author's death, a person might honorably write in their name and publish the text. In this scenario, the intent is not necessarily to deceive readers into thinking the author wrote it. A good example of this from the modern world is Martin Luther King Jr.'s Paul's Letter to American Christian, in which he writes in Paul's name, expressing what he, Dr. King, thinks Paul might say to American Christians in the 1960s. Finally, there are cases from the ancient world where someone wrote in someone else's name with the intent to deceive the audience. They nefariously wanted to put the author's credibility behind a document that the author did not in fact write. This last form of authorship, forgery, is often what people think when they hear the term epigraphy. For many, it's a bad word that has the connotation of fake, but this need not be the case. Pseudepigraphy literally means false ascription. Many of the different kinds of authorship that we just discussed could fall under the umbrella of pseudepigraphy, and many texts in the ancient world were commonly known to be written by people that were not their named author. Being pseudepigraphical does not necessarily automatically make a text illegitimate. This is important because many of the letters that are ascribed to Paul reflect these various forms of authorship, and some of these letters very well may be pseudepigraphical. New Testament scholars tend to divide Paul's letters into two broad categories: the undisputed or authentic letters and the disputed or Deutero-Pauline letters. When it comes to the 7 undisputed, nearly every New Testament scholar thinks Paul wrote or dictated. When it comes to the disputed letters, some New Testament scholars think that Paul did not write. I've listed the disputed letters from the most heavily contested down to the least contested. So, more scholars agree that Paul probably did not write the pastoral epistles, that is, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus. Probably around 80% of scholars think that Paul did not write these letters, while probably only about 40% of scholars think that Paul did not write Ephesians. There are a variety of reasons that scholars dispute that Paul was directly involved in the creation of these 6 disputed letters, and the reasons vary from letter to letter. In some cases, there's direct overlap between letters, suggesting that perhaps a later writer reused material from one of Paul's earlier letters. In other cases, the letters show variance from Paul's overarching literary output with respect to vocabulary, style, theology, and social issues. Still, other letters appear to address issues that would not have been live during Paul's lifetime, but were of greater concern in the 2nd century. To be clear, each of the 6 disputed letters do bear Paul's name. He is named the author of the text. For some people, this is enough. If it says Paul's name, then he must have written. Yet, to me and to many other New Testament scholars, this is a bit too simplistic and doesn't allow for the complexity of how authorship, dictation, and pseudepigraphy worked in the ancient world. We don't have to choose between two extremes, either Paul handwriting every single word in the Pauline corpus on the one hand, and anything he did not directly write being a forgery on the other hand. There are several different and very good options between these two positions. Number 1. Letters followed a particular format and contained recognizable generic elements. If you were going to write an email or a letter today, there are particular conventions you would probably follow. These conventions might change based on the person you were writing to and the nature of the communication, but you would likely include a greeting, perhaps some well wishes, and a closing. The same is true of the ancient world. There were conventional elements that were customarily included in letters. Not all of these show up in every letter, but they are common enough to be recognizable features of the genre. A letter usually began with the name of the sender, unlike modern conventions, which is to first address the reader, "Dear Dr. Elder." Immediately after the name of the sender in an ancient letter is the name of the recipient. Both the sender and the recipient might have modifiers that state something about who they were or their identity. A brief greeting, oftentimes this is just the word greetings or hello, comes after the names. Following the greeting, an ancient letter may or may not have included a thanksgiving or a prayer for the person being addressed. Sometimes specific gods are named in this thanksgiving. I thank Zeus for your good health. And sometimes it's more general. I pray to the gods that you are doing well. Then came the meat of the letter, the reason that the author wrote. Here, the specific circumstances of the letter are laid out, and this is where ancient letters are all going to look different from one another because each letter is addressing different circumstances. Usually the body of the letter is the longest part, but in some cases, the reason for writing is only indicated in a sentence or two. Remember, ancient letters are surprisingly short. Finally, the letter ended with a variety of conclusive elements. Oftentimes, the author will send greetings to specific people. Greet my brother Apollinarius, or from people they are with. Phoebe, your sister, says hello to you. In the conclusion, there's sometimes another wish for good health, a peace wish, or a simple goodbye as a way of signing off. And every so often, if an author forgot to include something in the body and had already started to sign off, they might include a postscript, PS, just as is common in our own modern letter. This is what this looks like in an ancient letter. Dias writes a letter to his father Horion. Remember, in Roman naming conventions, what we would call the last name comes first. So Aurelius is the last name, Dias is the first name, Horion is the first name. And Dias greets his father with the standard many greetings. He then says he prays daily to the local gods for his father. The reason Dias writes the body of the letter is to tell his dad that his studies are going fine and he has no need to worry. Most of this letter is actually taken up by the conclusion. Dias greets or salutes several different persons and passes along salutations from several other persons. We're going to close out here by having you look at and practice on this extremely short business letter. Take a second, maybe even pause the video here, and see if you can determine which part of the letter goes with which element. The salutation is here. Zenon to Caius, greeting. There's no thanksgiving in this letter. Zenon is getting straight to the point in the body. And the only conclusion is the farewell or goodbye. That's the very last word of the letter.